We are recording. Hey there, Robert. How are you?
Hi, Glenn. How you doing?
Doing well. Glenn Loury here, The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. And I'm talking to Mr. bloggingheads.tv. That would be one Robert Wright, who is the entrepreneur who got this whole show off the road here at Blogging Heads.
If I were an entrepreneur, I'd be rich, but I did get the show. I did. I was co-founder with Mickey Kaus and Greg Dingle.
You should be rich. I mean, this is a social good. People get paid for this kind of stuff. I'm not sure exactly how to do it, but you should be rich. I don't have a problem with that.
In a just society, Glenn, I'm sure we would both be richer than we are.
Anyway, Bob and I are doing this thing where we're trading visitations on each other's platform. I have been a guest at, was it The Meaning of Life or was it The Wright Show?
It was The Wright Show on bloggingheads.tv. The Wright Show, my show, actually appears on both, depending on the subject matter, but it's a unified podcast feed, The Wright Show. And you are always on Blogging Heads TV. Not that you don't occasionally venture into Meaning of Life topics.
I have on occasion. And I'm returning the favor by inviting Bob and hosting him here at the Glenn Show, which I should mention is sponsored by the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown, where I'm a professor. So here we are, Bob. So what are we talking about?
You're the interviewer. I just want to say how proud I am to finally be on the Glenn Show. I feel I've arrived.
That's kind of you to
my
say.
mother would be so proud. You've become a big thing. The Glenn Show has become a big thing.
Well, I'm happy to hear it. I don't actually have the metrics on hand to vouch for that, but you're saying that people
big.
are coming to the site and we're big. I'm doing my best. And I'm happy to be associated, I should say, in return. I can return the favor. I'm happy to be associated with bloggingheads.tv, which has changed my life. It's opened up a whole new avenue of activity for me here in the podcast land. I'm not sure I would have been doing it, but for serendipity that led me into this company. And now, with relatively little effort, I mean, one does have to read books that you're going to discuss and maybe do a little bit of research for an interview that you're going to have, but relatively little effort. I'm able to talk about ideas and politics and issues and opinions and get an audience, get feedback, get notice. So, yeah.
Be recognized in remote corners of the world, I hear. I mean, I've heard that from you.
No,
it doesn't happen to me. My show's not as big as the Glenn Show, but it happens to you.
It actually does happen to me. I mean, and I could go through it, but I've been through it. I mean, I've been in, Australia. I've been in England. People have come up and said, "Hey, I know you. You're Glenn Loury," and they know me from the Glenn Show. So, so we're happily joined here in the Blogging Heads enterprise. But I'm wondering what it looks like from your perspective, Bob. You must have pride. What impact do you think that we have been having with this venture? How does it relate to the other innovative things going on in the world of opinion journalism and online commentary and so forth like that? I'm asking you for your sage perspective. As an entrepreneur?
Well, it was certainly more innovative when it started than it is now. I mean, I co-founded it in 2005 with Mickey Kaus and Greg Dingle, who was a tech guy. That was 14 years ago, more than 14 years ago. And, at that point, you couldn't even do what we're doing now. People didn't have built-in webcams. You didn't have good broadband. You couldn't just have a video conversation with a person like anywhere in America. And in fact, originally, the two people could not see each other. And the way we did it, I mean, if you search your memory, you'll remember when we did it this way, that each person would record their own local video file. They'd be having a phone conversation. They could hear each other, of course. And then we would upload the two videos to a server and splice them together.
I do remember that.
And at that point, it was a new thing. The name Blogging Heads, may also not sound cutting edge, but at that point, of course, it was a play on Talking Heads, but it was a reference to the fact that, there were all these bloggers. Blogging was in its heyday, kind of early heyday almost, but heyday, and there were all these bloggers that were not prominent enough to get on cable TV. People hadn't seen them, and so one thing we did was put a bunch of bloggers on video for the first time, and now a number of them are on cable. Chris Hayes was his first video thing. Ari Melber, a lot of them went on to actually do that kind of stuff. So, it's not, we're not exactly on the, and I would say we were also an early podcast because there was always a downloadable audio file as well as the video. And today most people imbibe it via audio podcast, not video. So it's, it's been a long running podcast. I guess, in terms of what I'm proud of, I'm proud that I think people here are exposed to views other than just the views they will see on cable TV. You are certainly a good example of that, as you're well aware, right? That's almost your identity, right? Is that you and John, especially you and other people too, have conversations that might not be welcome on mainstream media. I've had conversations that wouldn't be welcome on mainstream media. That's by no means all of what Blogging Heads is. We have, other, for example, Bill Scher and Matt Lewis, who do the DMZ, they're not radicals, but one is on the right, one is on the left. They have a civil conversation every week. Yeah. And that itself these days, I think, is kind of a public service, given how polarized things are. So I don't know. Tell me when I've gone on too long.
You're doing fine. I was just going to say my identity is iconoclasm and pushing against the grain and saying things that others wouldn't say. And at one level, I want to take pride in that. Yeah, that's me. I'm out there all, on the limb. I'm brave. I'm bold. On the other hand, I'd like to think that I wish that my identity would be, he's an Ivy League professor and he's a distinguished economist and he's read a lot of books. He expresses himself very well. He has interesting things to say about the issues. He's not very predictable. I don't mind not being predictable. I don't mind, going outside the lines a little bit now and then. But I hate to be thought of primarily as a bomb thrower, an iconoclast, a naysayer, a curmudgeon, a contrarian, because I feel that maybe that doesn't take me sufficiently seriously. Maybe it pigeonholes me and is more of a kind of ad hominem reaction to what I'm saying. Who is this guy who's talking to me? Oh, he's one of those. And then, if I may say so, Bob, being black doesn't make this whole thing any easier. Not that I'm complaining, not that I'm crying and whining, but I'm just saying, there are people out there who will say, oh, you're a black guy and you're saying these things. And then there's a whole nother dimension of reprobation that comes in the train of that observation. So I chafe a little bit, but I guess I've earned this characterization.
Well, this isn't the place to talk strategy, but if you'd like us to steer you toward a new identity, I'm sure we can think about a series of guests. Now that you've got the visibility, sky's the limit. We'll I'll have some of my highly paid marketing experts get in touch with you. But you actually do. You do have a big stage now, and you could have you could have various kinds of people on, have various kinds of conversations. But
I wonder whether, as a proprietor of our collective enterprise here, you have any thoughts about exactly this branding question. So the Glenn Show has this reputation. Glenn is. We've been saying, we've been soft pedaling the thing here. Glenn is a contrarian. Glenn is someone who talks against it. They're really talking about Glenn being a conservative or too conservative or more conservative than, I don't know, some, normal position. And I'm wondering whether you worry, and it's just an honest question, that because you must read the comments. You're the guy in charge over there at Blogging Heads. You must look at what people are saying. I read the comments, and a lot of them are, why don't we get some black people out there that have a different point of view than this guy? It's an echo chamber. he's always saying the same thing, which is that the social justice warriors and the Black Lives Matter people and the Ta-Nehisi Coates of the world and the Ava DuVernays and the Nicole Hannah Joneses of the world, blah, 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 are wrong about, and Al Sharpton's a bad guy and, blah, blah, blah. They're always saying this, he is, that they say I am. And, we deserve to have a more diverse airing of these race-related views. So are you worried about that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say, of course, I naturally tend to think of it from, the perspective of blogging heads as a whole. And one thing I think is, there's various other perspectives on blogging heads as a whole, to the extent that I get blowback that's comparable to your blowback. It has to do with foreign policy issues that are identified more as left than right, even though on foreign policy it's a little more complicated than that. But yeah. So I don't think anybody would look at the network as a whole and say, it's a right-wing enterprise. That said, I understand why. And now, I should say, I try to counterbalance that by having neoconservatives on in conversation with me. And I think you would be happy to do the corresponding thing. And the truth is, you have issued at least some invitations that have not been warmly received, right? To people you have been critical of. And I think maybe we should buckle down and work harder to find some people who fit that perspective who will come on and talk to you. But it's not as if you have yourself rejected that prospect.
No, that's correct. Perhaps I haven't tried as hard as I should. And, if you can't get Ta-Nehisi Coates or Nicole Hannah Jones, then maybe you should go for it. And I don't want to name anybody.
you don't want to say who is second tier.
But such people exist. I think we can stipulate that and get some people on and mix it up a little bit. I have done that in a kind of, circuitous way by inviting my son, Glenn the Second.
Well, that's a good example, actually. Yeah.
That was great. And we've had very robust.
That was great. That was great stuff. I mean, not just from the crass perspective of wanting a lot of people to watch, having high traffic. It was just a kind of conversation you're not going to see many places. And you've had more than one.
Yeah, we have, and we'll have more. I think we're going to, stick our necks out and talk in public more. You should have been at Thanksgiving dinner. There was never a dull moment,
I'll bet. I've got some family reunions I should invite you to, too. I have 3 siblings who voted for Trump.
I see. 3?
3. Although we actually, at the family reunions, we just avoid discussing the subject entirely because we all know that, the place would go up in smoke very rapidly.
Are you comfortable with the black guys at bloggingheads.tv, which is the way I invariably introduce myself and John?
You mean comfortable with that introduction? The black guys yeah, I think you should trademark it. It's good.
With that branding, with that bringing of blogging heads into this kind of very freighted and fraught, national discourse about race?
I think you're absolutely raising questions that should be raised and aren't being raised enough. Like you, I wish that you could more often get somebody who disagrees with you sharply and whom you've criticized to join you in the conversation, because that's what's most lacking in America today broadly. And I think we can do it. I think it's good that we're having this conversation because maybe we'll both vow to actually brainstorm about people who could come on. But I think you're raising very valuable questions, and I have more than once found myself in agreement with you. Now don't put me on the spot by making me make me elaborate here. But now, lately you've gotten particularly edgy, and I think we'll have time to talk about that. But we don't need to jump into that right now. I think look, as a liberal and as somebody who hopes that the Democrats will win the next election, I worry that identity politics is going to become a significant problem for Democrats politically, if in no other sense. Leave aside the merits of the question, I think it's tactically challenging to spend to make identity politics too much of the identity of the Democratic Party in the eyes of your kind of swing voters or whoever you're trying to attract. As for, you mentioned your race. It's interesting. I suppose in some ways, you said it's harder for you to be black and be addressing these issues. And I assume everyone knows what we're talking about. I assume we're talking mainly to, an audience familiar with your views. But you've challenged kind of, identity politics to say the least.
And I'm critical of affirmative action. And I am far from being persuaded about reparations. And I'm very worried that the consequences of the Black Lives Matter movement might also be a diminution of public safety in some urban communities because of the way that police are responding to the political environment that's been created. Mm-hmm. And I'm generally dissatisfied with the quality of intellectual and political leadership amongst African-American ranks, which I think is mired in a vision of the country and of the conditions of people of color, I should say of African-Americans specifically, that is anachronistic and just inadequate intellectually and politically to the challenges that we face. Just to give a short compass of my iconoclasm.
In a nutshell. And You're saying that being black makes it harder. From my point of view, it may be easier that you're black. I would think from your point of view, in terms of the kind of blowback you get, is it too simple to say that the question of your race is a question of whether you're going to get called a racist or an Uncle Tom? If you're white and you're saying this stuff, you're going to get called a racist, right?
Well, something like that. It's a question of motive. There'll be something like, well, he's always criticizing these people. Why doesn't he criticize those people? There'll be he must be jealous because some people are getting more attention than he's getting and they have different views than himself. And that's somehow tied to the fact of who is going to be recognized by the cultural barons at the magazines and the websites and the newspapers as the most, foremost commentators on questions about race, and people accuse me of jealousy and of disloyalty. They'll say, you're betraying your own people. You wash dirty linen in public. You take too much relish in your criticism, whatever the merits of them, etc.
Yeah, and I'm sure it is hard. I think it would be. I think you would find yourself getting painful blowback if you were white. They would use different words, but I can't know. Either way. I have kind of my own version of this. Again, it's not that it's comparable. I don't want to overly dramatize my own situation, but I say things about foreign policy that where you get a sense that some of the blowback is not merely substantive criticism. Some of it is kind of speech policing, attempts to intimidate you, and maybe I'll give you some examples later, but it's something that I think is worth fighting just in principle. The idea of constraining speech via ad hominem attacks. And I want to say I'm not totally against all known speech codes. I'm not. For example, living in a multi-ethnic society is challenging, and our country knows that maybe certainly better than most, maybe better than any, but it's very challenging. And, for example, for the N-word to be verboten, I can see that. And I can see, various, sensitivities we have to be attentive to, and that attentiveness, might logically assume the form of a speech code, as it does in some cases. And that's okay. So it's not a trivially easy issue, right? Like, when have the speech police gone too far? Because I think there's a place for speech police. But, in any society, in part because if you don't keep tensions under control, kind of normatively via the informal sanction of moral approbation and so on and disapproval, then the government may have to do it, and that has perils that are in some ways greater.
Greater.
So that's a long way of saying I'm not against the very idea of rules of the road in terms of what you can say, but I think we both agree there's such a thing as overly constraining rules that are not good for the world or the country.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard problem. Because, for example, I think some of the rules which are compelling on their face, the N-word would be one of them, preclude certain kinds of speech that I think warrant to be included within the acceptable ambit. So, for example, ridicule,
right,
parody, satire, comedy. Imagine a comedian, I don't know, Richard Pryor or Chris Rock or one of these guys using the N-word in a routine where he's talking about whatever he is talking about or she's talking about. The N-word, the C word, the F word, the MF words, these words come into play. And in the context, they are more than just merely acceptable. They're at some level an essential part of what the performer is doing. Or imagine that, okay, so we got a president that a lot of people don't like. There's nothing wrong with ridiculing him, right? I mean,
well, I think public figures should be particularly in bounds as targets. I mean, that said, I wouldn't. There are things I would not.
But can I ridicule one of my liberal professors who comes out with all too predictable and all too silly pronouncement about whatever the issue might be, and I don a mask and a costume. I go out onto public square and I say this is ridiculous in so many words, and I laugh at this person and I caricature them. Can I caricature them? I can't caricature Muhammad, the prophet. I understand that because I value my life.
Well, I would not caricature him for other reasons. There are things I wouldn't say about Jesus. There are.
So you object to Mapplethorpe's Kiss Christ?
It's funny you should say that because it's funny you should say that because I was at the New Republic. I don't know if this was the period when I was actually acting editor. But that issue came up. I was acting editor of the New Republic for 7 months. The Piss Christ, if people don't remember, I think it was a crucifix in a jar that supposedly was full of urine. I don't know.
A beaker that was supposed to be urine.
Now that was art. And I think worse still, I think it was federally subsidized art. I think that was the issue.
That was the issue. In some sense.
And I said, my position was, look, maybe the federal government just shouldn't be in the business of subsidizing art. And that was taken as like reactionary. There were people on staff who called me a Philistine because that was something that some conservatives were saying. But I didn't, on these issues, I don't know if you want to call this conservative or what, but for example, when the play, The Book of Mormon hit Broadway, I was uncomfortable with that. I was like, wait a second. We're allowed to criticize Mormons in a way we would not criticize various other groups. I mean, there are groups you cannot imagine doing that play about. And I'm not a big ridiculer of religions, to say the least. So that's,
okay.
And now as for what speech code should apply, I don't know. I just encourage people not to do it. It just rarely, I think it rarely has good effects. I think it creates more fundamentalists than it, cures, if that's the right word, which fundamentalists would say it's not. So there's all that, on ridicule though, it depends. I couldn't help but thinking of Don Rickles. Do you remember Don Rickles?
Yeah, I remember him very well.
There's a guy who would be on national TV, and this probably didn't happen often, but he'd start picking on people in the audience, and he'd see a black guy and make a joke about watermelons. I mean, he would, and I think you might defend him by saying, one complicated thing about ridicule is it's often done as a sign of affection. And I think sometimes people will make jokes that can totally be taken the wrong way, that are ethnically charged, and they actually mean for it to be a tool of inclusion, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
I think I do. There's a kind of intimacy in it. I'm calling you this name, but I'm doing it out of in jest or out of love or,
right.
Whatever.
Now, that's certainly not always.
And only if we were friends would I dare to venture into this territory.
That is exactly it. It's a way of saying we must be friends because I'm joking about your being Italian or you being a cheapskate Scot or whatever. That's right.
Yeah. So what do you think about the recent brouhaha over new Department of Education regulations governing anti-Semitism on college campuses and meant, as I understand it, I could be wrong, to counter the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement that is trying to bring pressure against the state of Israel for its occupation of the West Bank and so on?
I'm against it. I want to hear your view very much, and this may lead us into a subject that I'm happy to discuss, which is the intellectual dark web with which you, I think, associate yourself. But let me say for people who don't know, so Trump issued an executive order that ostensibly is designed to combat anti-Semitism. I suspect it will actually have the opposite effect. But in any event, it embraces a particular definition of anti-Semitism, and by the way, the person who is the author of that definition, who chaired the committee that came up with that definition, thinks that this is a misapplication of the definition. But the definition, I didn't know that. Yeah, he wrote a piece for the Times 2 years ago when I think maybe the Department of Education was in a different way going to make reference to that something. He was saying this should not be a guideline used on campuses. But in any event, that definition of anti-Semitism, which this guy says is fine for purposes of monitoring countries and gathering data about where you are seeing anti-Semitism, it's just not. The guy, again, the author of it, one of the authors of it, is saying it's not fine as a trigger for actual policing, and that's what the Trump now wants to use it as, because what he's saying is, if there's anti-Semitism on campuses, we can withdraw federal funding from the colleges. And the definition of anti-Semitism includes certain kinds of extreme criticisms of Israel, such as saying that the existence of Israel is racist, or comparing the policies of Israel to the policies of the Nazi regime that is explicitly singled out as a sign of anti-Semitism. So I'm imagining a case where you've got a panel discussion on campus, and say you've got a Palestinian, say it's not a Palestinian, whoever it is really not happy about the occupation of the West Bank. And let's say that they say the Israeli soldiers are using Gestapo tactics on the West Bank. And let me just pause and say I've been on the West Bank, and I don't personally compare the tactics to Gestapo tactics, but I think if I described in detail some of the things that happened there, you'd probably agree that one could observe them and invoke comparisons to Gestapo tactics without being motivated by anti-Semitism. These are things that are happening that just in a person with an acute sense of justice or something, they might say that and just not be anti-Semitic. It just, to me, is not some kind of clear-cut evidence of anti-Semitism. But my question is, so if there's a panel discussion on a campus and a student just says something about the, quote, Gestapo tactics of the soldiers on the West Bank, according to a reasonably straightforward interpretation of this executive order, Trump could take away the federal funding for that college unless they discipline that student. And to me, that seems like dangerous territory. I
think we agree, Bob. I see two areas of potential agreement between us. I'm not a fan of this move that the Trump administration is making at all, and it feels to me a step toward thought policing and prohibiting criticism of Israel and of Zionism as being ipso facto a racist, or in this case, anti-Semitic expression. And I don't know why it is that if a group of people, God bless them, decide to understand themselves as a nation, my withholding of an acknowledgement of that understanding, think the Kurds, constitutes an act of bigotry. It does not. I don't have to live in your world, I would say to the people who accuse me of bigotry when I fail to get on board with their project. I can have my own views about their project. I may be wrong in my views about their project. I may be unkind without historical sensibility, whatever, but I'm hardly a racist for not signing on to their project, it would seem to me. So that's one thing. The other thing that troubles me about it is that they have to go through this national origin, if I understand the law, avenue in order to include Jewishness and views about Israel within the reach of the civil rights regulation. And I'm just wondering whether that doesn't itself constitute a kind of move, a kind of political positioning that ought to be open to criticism. And I say I'm wondering because I don't know. I haven't thought deeply about this. Are Jews a people? Are they a nation? I have students here at Brown, they're Jewish. I say something in my classroom about Israel and Palestine. I've offended them because of their national origin. They were born in Hoboken, New Jersey.
Yeah. No,
what is that? You've imported into our domestic laws regulating discrimination against minority groups a specific position about an international issue that's in dispute.
Yeah, I do think the issue of what kind of group are Jews, religious, national, racial, is at the center of this. And actually, this is a reminder. I never miss an opportunity to plug this newsletter I put out a few times a month. It's called the Non-Zero Newsletter, NONZERO. You can go to nonzero.org and sign up. But in the last issue, I had just a little 2-paragraph summary of this issue that wasn't explicitly judgmental, but did get into this issue that you've just raised a little bit. And the deal is, this executive order invokes Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Title VI does not forbid discrimination based on religion, but on nationality or race. So there's been disagreement over, well, does this executive order classify Jews as a national group or not? It almost does it explicitly, maybe not explicitly. It kind of discusses the issue, but by implication, certainly, if you're invoking Title VI, there is the implication that you're viewing Jews as a national group and not just as a religious group. And of course, the irony is that this is something that a lot of anti-Semites love to do, right? I mean, they want to be able to say every Jew is loyal to Israel, and this is the problem with various things. And a number of Jews that I know are quite aware of that and resented very much the implication of this executive order that they are a national group. And but you're right that's the issue. And in general, my own view is, I think the people who want to fight anti-Semitism by constraining speech about Israel are sincere by and large. I don't think they're just saying, hey, what I really am is pro-Israel. Let's use the anti-Semitism issue as an excuse to give people blowback for criticizing Israel. But so I'm willing to grant that most of them are sincere. I just think it's a tactical mistake. I think it works in the other way. I think, constraining speech about, or trying to constrain speech about Israel, doing that kind of speech policing, can engender a kind of resentment that expresses itself in anti-Semitism. I don't have much empirical support for that, but it just given the way human psychology works, and given some things I've seen, I think that's probably the case.
What do you want to say about the intellectual dark web?
Well, just that.
Oh, but let me just say, I don't identify myself with it.
Oh, okay.
People out there identified me with it. I was just sitting over here blogging heads, minding my own business, doing my podcast. Yeah. And then there are people like Megan Down, the writer, whom I know you know, who has
not personally,
she discovers the nuance and the complexity of the thinking at Glenn and John McWhorter, the Glenn Show.
You guys had a big impact on her.
Evidently.
And she's, she's got a book out, and she's discussed it on. Hey, have you had her on the show?
It just hasn't posted yet. It's in the queue.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead. But yeah, the intellectual dark web. Now, I have heard you and John speak about it. I guess what you do is note that you're being identified with it, and you don't exactly seem to mind. I guess that's what I'd say.
That's it.
Okay.
Although I must say, in a long drive to North Carolina during a summer a couple of years ago, my son was in the car with me, my son Glenn II, and I had an audio book of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules, and I wanted to listen to it. And do you know that the kid just blew his top? I mean, he almost tore the door off the vehicle. It was just not going to be possible to listen to Jordan Peterson at the same time with my son being in the vehicle.
I see great things for that kid.
You say what?
That's good. I see great things for him in his future. That
shows
a combination of energy and good judgment that I applaud.
So, no, we have not objected to being associated with the likes of Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson and these characters. Although I think people are only saying it because John and I have been saying things about race that are in a way not dissimilar from some of the intellectual dark web figures, cutting across the grain of the accepted sensibility amongst the elite opinion makers.
Yeah, what I was going to say was, and actually, I gather we'll eventually get around to. I have two things that are related to say about the intellectual dark web.
Yeah.
One of them's not original. That's the one I'll say now. And the other one I actually came to mind in listening to your recent conversations about the Trayvon Martin case,
which we'll get
to. But this one is just that the intellectual dark web, it seems to me, likes to think of itself as, in a sense, transcending ideology. Not that the people who constitute it don't have ideologies, but they think that, like, what the intellectual dark web is about opposition to speech policing, support for free thought, and so on. One long-standing critique of that either implicit or explicit claim, it comes from, I guess you could say, the Glenn Greenwalds of the world, who would point out that the people in the intellectual dark web seem more eager to fight some kinds of speech policing than others. So they seem, for example, more forgiving of, say, Islamophobia, more defensive of people who have been accused of that, and a number of people in the intellectual dark web have.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, and so on. Then is the case with, say, anti-Semitism. And this is the Glenn Greenwald critique. And, out of curiosity, with that in mind, and actually also knowing that I was going to be talking to you and some of these issues might come up, when this executive order was issued, I just went and checked out some of the Twitter feeds of people in the intellectual dark web. And I said, well, if Glenn's right, Glenn Greenwald is right about this critique, I guess you won't find many people in the IDW standing up and opposing what could be construed as an attempt by Trump to constrain speech on campus.
Clearly.
And it wasn't a huge sample. I just looked at 4 or 5 Twitter feeds, but the only references to it I saw were on the other side of it. I didn't see anybody clearly explicitly embracing it. But for example, Barry Weiss, who kind of wrote the definitive piece on the intellectual dark web by way of embracing it in the New York Times, she tweeted to somebody arguing that, see, it doesn't define Jews as a national group. So in a way was defending, or at least pushing against the blowback, the pushback against the executive order in a certain sense defensive. But I couldn't find anybody. This to me seems like one of the more clear-cut efforts to constrain speech, and I'd like to know, has anybody in the IDW, as of whatever today is, the 17th of December, have they pushed back against it? This is one criticism of the IDW, is that actually they do have an ideology, which, by the way, is fine.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with ideologies. It's just if your claim is that what you represent is trans-ideological, but on close scrutiny actually has an ideology implicit in it, then let's be clear about that. That's all.
Well, you may be surprised to know that I agree with you about the fact that the iconoclasts who have self-branded as IDW have an ideology. By the way, I just want to note, you did hear me, if I'm included in the IDW crowd, speak against the Trump order.
You have the option of falsifying my hypothesis by retroactively claiming membership at this moment. Yes.
Well, here's what I want to say. I've been having this ongoing discussion with Jonathan Haidt, at NYU, the psychologist. And
yeah, I know John.
The progenitor of the Heterodox Academy organization, which is a group of us, academics who are self-declared proponents of intellectual and ideological diversity being enhanced on campuses. And John and I have been having this argument, friendly argument. I'm on the board at Heterodox Academy.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of the argument is I want to say, there are two levels of discourse. One of them is about substantive issues where ideology matters. Left and right stuff matters. Taxes, cultural things, guns, family, religion, the race, where your commitments, your philosophical commitments, your partisan commitments about values and what should the state be doing and what's the right way to order society are pertinent. That's one level of discourse. Another level is about, will they let me say my opinion when it comes time for my opinion? Does Charles Murray get a pie in the face when he shows up on campus? Are they shouting me down and editing me out of the whatever? Which is about procedure, about process, about form. And I, perhaps inappropriately, but this is my view, and I respect John, think he's too focused on the latter and not enough on the former. Too much about let's make the rules so that every voice is heard, and not enough about the fact that those people who are actually running the institutions are wrong. Okay, I want to say they're wrong about affirmative action. It's not that I can't criticize affirmative action without having my life being made unpleasant by people who don't like my view. It's that they actually are in control of the institution and they're making the policy, and the policy about affirmative action is wrong.
So you want that to be an official position of the Heterodox Academy?
No, I know it can never be, because the Heterodox Academy understands itself. Its raison d'etre is to avoid taking positions like that so as to maintain its credibility on the process argument.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying the harm that's being done, in my humble opinion, is, 70% substance and 30% process. And I hate that we forbear from engaging the substantive disputes on behalf of maintaining our credibility. We don't want anybody to think that we have an ideology. But of course we have an ideology.
But they don't discourage individual members of the Heterodox Academy from arguing against affirmative action, do they?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not.
Okay.
Of course not.
And they would say that the emphasis on the process side is a way of making room for that.
Yeah, they would say. And when you get down the cases, it's well, maybe all I'm doing is revealing myself to be more ideological than Jonathan Haidt is.
No, I think John is ideological, possibly more than he talks about.
Okay, but, then more openly and honestly ideological, perhaps, is what I want to say.
I think maybe that is what you're saying. Is let's admit it. There's no such thing as a non-ideological entity in this universe.
I think that is what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, I kind of agree. And, I did a piece in Wired about Sam Harris arguing that what seemed to me to be at least an implicit claim by him that he was, for some purpose, that he was more aware of his tribalism and closer to being able to transcend it than some folks. I kind of took that as an excuse to try to argue that his actually tribalism of various kinds enters his discourse and his psychology in various ways. And I don't maintain that I'm not the same. But
what tribe does Sam belong to? I actually don't know.
Oh gosh. The issue, I don't want to, it's been so long since I wrote the piece that I don't want to, what I was arguing was that there were various cognitive biases at work in him, as in all of us, that could be seen at work when he talked about Islam being the problem, when he talked about Israel-Palestine, when he talked about particular issues. So I guess I would say it's kind of the new atheist tribe. It's kind of the new atheist ideology, being one that, first of all, sees religion as the problem in a way that I don't. I think that's just a confused way of looking at causality in kind of human affairs, to think that the doctrines, you could almost, I needn't get too far into this, but there was no answer in my piece to the question of what tribe Sam belongs to. The point was just that ideological bias, I argued, was at work in him in various subtle ways, that it's at work in all of us, and we should all admit it. But try to transcend it, that's fine.
This is a little bit off the beaten path, but I was in Israel last spring on a visit that was organized by Walter Russell Mead. You know who I'm talking about, the writer of On
Yeah, I know
Policy.
Walter a little. I think I can guess the ideological drift of this particular thing, but go ahead and tell us.
Well, it was very friendly to the Zionist project, of course, but we did spend time in Ramallah, and we met a number of Palestinians at high levels, academics and political people, and people on the street. But we spent most of our time in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And it was definitely friendly to the project, the Zionist project, whatever. But it was also, for me, at a personal level, it was just very powerfully evocative and moving. Moving maybe is not the right word. I saw such despair and defeat in Ramallah. I saw such hopelessness. I saw such confidence, and near unanimity would be too strong, but there was definitely a convergence of view amongst a range of people. I didn't talk to far left Israelis, but I did talk to people who would have been, in the peace movement 10 years ago, but who have moved a fair amount. We talked to parliamentarians, we talked to academics, we talked to public officials. There was confidence, and I had a feeling of creeping annexation. I visited Gush Etzion, one of the settlements that's built into the side of a hill, man. It looks like a city of 100,000 people over there. Those people aren't going anywhere as far as I can tell. And you can look across the valley and you could see the Palestinian villages. Just on the other side of, you could throw a stone and you could hit them. Mm-hmm. I came out of there thinking that if I were a Palestinian, I would be in profound despair and feeling like I don't know which way to go. The Jews are in control of that situation, and they're calling the shots.
Was this your first time in Israel, or your first time in the West Bank? It was
my first time in quite a few years. I had been there in 1987 previously, and in 1979 before that. So it had been near 30 years since I'd been in Israel.
Yeah, I've been there twice. I was there about 9 years ago, and I went on a tour of a very different ideological cast. The main tour guides on the West Bank was a guy from a group called Breaking the Silence. These are former soldiers in the IDF, former Israeli soldiers.
Yeah.
Who decided that the occupation has to end. And so they were our guides. So they show you things like you go to Hebron And they're like, okay, see this nice paved street? This is where the Jews can walk. See that rocky path up there? That's where the Palestinians have to walk. And, you see things like that. And, and again, I was saying, if you go to the West Bank, you can be provoked to say things that might sound extreme that would be motivated by something other than anti-Semitism, just by, just a sense of justice. And who knows, maybe if I had enough background, I'd have a different view. And maybe, it truly is vital to the security of someone or other, but to be this heavy-handed with policing. But the point is just to get back to that other point, it's not a crazy thing to have an extreme reaction to a number of the things. You see these guys in Breaking the Silence they were so impressive because they really were working, it seemed to me, to actually give me both sides of the story to the extent that was possible. I mean, in other words, they were against the occupation, but they did do a good job of conveying why Israelis feel threatened, feel fear, why some of these policies are driven by fear. I came away there thinking, oh man, all this talk about a two-state solution, there was a time when that made sense. It's just too late. It ain't gonna happen. Yeah, the settlements that are so profusely embedded in the West Bank, they are connected by roads, that almost no Palestinians who live in the West Bank are allowed to drive on. And so Palestinians are increasingly encircled by, it's just, you just can't unscramble the egg or the omelet or whatever the metaphor is. And that's, you said if you're Palestinian, you wonder which way do you go. More and more Palestinians are thinking, okay, one state solution. Right. The question is what kind? And right. What they would tell you is either it's going to be an apartheid state in a pretty literal sense, or it's going to be or it's going to be, in effect, non-Zionist, probably, because if you allow the Palestinians of the West Bank to vote, I don't think you're quite to the point where them combined with the Palestinians in Israel proper, who of course have Israeli citizenship, would constitute a majority. But obviously, you got to be talking about a very different kind of situation if you give them.
That's my sense of it as well.
Yeah.
Okay. A few minutes left here. Maybe we'll talk about Trayvon Martin. Okay, so let me tell people, if they don't know, that John McWhorter and I at the Glenn Show have had a couple of conversations about an expose documentary film by a filmmaker named Joel Gilbert called The Trayvon Hoax, which alleges that basically George Zimmerman was railroaded in 2013 in his trial for the killing of Trayvon Martin. And that a witness identity switch hoax was perpetrated on the court and on the American people in the process of that trial. You can refer to our conversations, John and I, that were recently posted at the Glenn Show for more about that. But the question arises as to how one deals with the statements and claims that are made by people in the public square when we know that these people have a ideological and political identity, and we have reason to think that they might not be unbiased. And Joel Gilbert is a conservative without any doubt, and we could talk some about other things that he's done. I'm happy to do that. They do give one the feeling that he and Dinesh D'Souza, if they don't know each other, ought to know each other. I think like that because they're in the same business, which is tearing down the Democratic Party and the Obama presidency and whatnot like that. And why would John and I take such a thing seriously? And worse than that, why would we besmirch the wonderful reputation of bloggingheads.tv by having such conversations on our platform? And I just want to invite you to comment on that.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me start by saying I've now seen pretty much the documentary. I'm not going to say I'm not going to say I paid close attention to every little bit. There was some stuff that seemed a little tangential that I fast forwarded through, but before I talk about the documentary, you said you're happy to talk about his background a little more. And I think, anybody going into the documentary, should be familiar with it. You and John pointed out that in your first conversation, he has been on Alex Jones's show. Alex Jones, of course, the notorious conspiracy theorist who for a long time was trying to convince people the Sandy Hook massacre hadn't actually happened. It was faked. It was a hoax. He finally, in a court case, I think, conceded that it was real, but Alex Jones is kind of trouble. I think, yes, Gilbert has been on the show a number of times. I gather, having done a little more research, he's actually guest hosted it.
Yeah, he's guest hosted
it. And he's done, you mentioned the Dreams from My Real Father, the documentary in which he claimed that Obama's real father was some communist, not the guy Obama says is his father. He, in addition, I guess in 2010 put out something called Paul McCartney Really Is Dead. That was his documentary, The Last Testament of George Harrison. He followed that up with a documentary called Elvis Found Alive. He has since apparently shortly before the Obama stuff came out, he said those were mockumentaries, but actually I've seen a 2010 interview in which they were billed as documentaries at the time, and he is defending it as a documentary in 2010. So, and then there are various, problems that have been found with the Obama thing. So with all that as background, and one reason that matters is in the documentary, and I'm about to say something kind about it, so bear with me. But in the documentary, there are, or at least about you.
Okay, I'll take it. Yeah. At this point, I'll take it.
In the documentary, there are a number of cases where there's like a short segment of somebody speaking, and he interprets it one way and tells us what the right interpretation is. And I know there was more context to it, and it could be that he's right about what it means. It could be that when the attorney for Trayvon Martin's mother says we pressed for a statement or something, he's saying that means they coerced her. Maybe it could well mean something else.
Yeah.
There's a number of cases like that, or when the witness who, again, the premise is that a witness was swapped. Yeah. That the girl who was actually talking to Trayvon on the phone shortly before his death got cold feet.
Yeah.
And they swapped in her half sister, Rachel Gentile, I think is the name.
That's correct.
And so they've got her saying, another clipped thing is, I feel guilt. And, well, okay, but it's not clear to me what.
About what?
And he's saying that, it's guilt because she knows, blah, blah, blah. So with all of these kinds of things, I do think the established credibility of the director matters. I don't think that his history does him a favor here, in the eyes of the viewer. Now, and there's a lot of cases like that. Now, all that said, I would say, having watched, the whole thing, I would say the claim about the witness swapping, at a minimum, warrants further investigation. And the reason I say that is because it seems to me, and again, I'm not saying it's true. Yeah. I'm just saying that for this documentary not to mean it warrants further investigation would mean that Joel Gilbert has either fabricated or misrepresented evidence on a pretty significant scale, right? Like the whole thing about the address of the two houses,
right.
the phone records, whose phone, there are a lot of things that together give you pause. And if our journalistic system is working as it should, then there should be a reporter somewhere in Florida who says, I'm going to follow up on this. And, there are still some weird things about it. Like, like the two voices that supposedly aren't from the same person. Well, given the two snippets, we won't get into the details, but it did kind of sound like that. But why not take the whole thing to a voice expert? I mean, he took the handwriting to a handwriting expert who again, just says a couple of things tightly edited. I'm not sure. But, now the other thing I'd say is, the stakes of this are not as high as they would have been George Zimmerman had been convicted.
Yeah.
Because after all, the witness, whatever it was, if there was witness tampering, witness swapping, it failed.
Yeah.
That's their side did not win. The other thing is the stakes will be higher if it turns out there is prosecutorial misconduct. I don't think he's alleging that. I think it's possible that the prosecutor, which presented the false evidence, had been deceived by the lawyer for Trayvon Martin's mother, if indeed there was deception at all.
Yeah.
But, so the stakes, it's not clear that the stakes in the legal context are very high. I know, Joel Gilbert has this premise that the Trayvon Martin case was critical in igniting the series of controversies, Michael Brown and so on.
He does.
That's hard to know for sure. I do think, the way he talks about that, I mean, especially at the end, it makes it clear that, as you said, he has a very clear political agenda and almost a conspiratorial one in the sense that, the view seems to be this was all part of a plot to get a Democrat elected. Well, no, I would guess if it's true that it happened, it's more like a kind of a lawyer who's a little bit of a hustler and would like more publicity and more money. And Trayvon's mother having her agenda and a witness backing out at the last minute and then some kind of blah, blah, blah. But all that said, I'm proud of the fact that that on Blogging Heads, you bring an issue like this, up, because issues like this should be brought up because if witnesses are swapped, that should be known. I hope someone will follow up on it.
Go ahead.
I'm not persuaded yet, but it's a fair thing for you to be discussing.
Well, I couldn't have asked for more than that. I mean, I should say that neither John nor I were prepared to say this is true. We both said we don't know whether it's true or not. We said, however, that upon viewing Gilbert's documentary film, we walked away thinking it might be true and it should be looked into. And if it were true, that would be a bad thing for talking about the character of American politics and how susceptible we are to being manipulated by actors behind the scenes who present. And then the media, narratives get created and they have a life of their own. Michael Brown's hand up, don't shoot, etc. So I couldn't have asked for any more from you upon reviewing the material that prompted us to post conversations on Joel Gilbert's work in the first place than to say, well, it may be sketchy in certain places and certainly he's a sketchy character, but, upon reviewing the evidence that he presents, it's something that ought to be taken seriously and looked into. And it's going to be looked into, apparently, because a big lawsuit has been brought by George Zimmerman against the attorneys and the principals involved, alleging basically what Gilbert alleges in his film. But we got a lot of flack from the Blogging Heads audience about being willing to take this up.
Well, maybe I should give you more. I don't know. But I mean, I do want to emphasize that I think I don't use the word evil about anyone. I try not to. But if I use it about someone, Alex Jones would be in the running. I just think he's a horrible, destructive human. And I don't know if he understands what kind of fire he's playing with. And by the way, actually, I mean, in listening to you and John, if there's one thing I could have interjected, there's a few things I might have interjected, but I did, maybe John will talk about this later, the use of the word hoax. I think I'm right in remembering that John used it to apply to everything from this to Tawana Brawley to Michael Brown. I think hoax clearly applies to Tawana Brawley and Jesse Smollett, if that's the name.
Yeah.
There's kind of a hoax embedded within this story, although when I first heard the name, the Trayvon Martin hoax, I thought they were, given the Alex Jones Association, I thought they were saying there was no murder of Trayvon, but anyway, that aside, I think Michael Brown is probably a more complicated case if you look at the way that narrative unfolded. Yeah. And what I want to say is I think hoax is a very dangerous word that we should use carefully. I mean, I recently ran into a guy I didn't know before. I was in a place where I recurringly run into people. He believes that all these school shootings are done by the government.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, no. And, he's got like an NRA insignia on some of his stuff. Nothing wrong with that, but it does mean he probably owns a gun. So we've got a guy who owns a gun who thinks, in my community, who thinks that you get it right. That makes me a little concerned.
I do.
And you know this guy has heard the word hoax, and it's a good bet he's heard it from Alex Jones. And anyone associated with Alex Jones to the extent of being his guest host, someone I have grave doubts and concerns about. But to get back to this point, I would say, I think the word hoax should be used just carefully. It applies in some of these cases. Tawana Brawley, Jussie Smollett. And maybe this one, if it's true, although it's a slightly smaller kind of hoax in a sense.
As I understand Gilbert's motivation, and I don't know him, and I this is all speculation on my part, but what I'd say is, based on viewing the film and reading a significant part of the book that he produced about Trayvon Martin, and viewing some of his other work, is that he thinks the country is being pushed into a much more conflictual posture around racial issues, especially around policing, African-American men, the Black Lives Matter portfolio, than is warranted by the objective reality. Mm-hmm. If I had to bet, he'd say the Central Park Five were guilty and, whatever. If I had to bet, I know what he says about Michael Brown, but I think he would say that much more generally, this idea that Black people are being set upon by police, you have to have the talk with your kid and make sure they're safe when they encounter, is all a hyped up, manufactured crisis by ethnic entrepreneurs who are ambulance chasing around the country, looking for every little case in a country of 300 million people. Incidents are going to happen. When the circumstances are sufficiently ambiguous that you don't know for sure what happened, these characters come into play and massage it. There's a media that's willing to, in the Zimmerman case, gives ample, example of misstatement, exaggeration, a distorted presentation of evidence on behalf of a narrative. And this is the thing that he's against.
Could be. I think if you ask why are the commenters some of them so incensed, they'd probably point out that, well, that might account for this, but then how about the Barack Obama smear where, and apparently in that, he said that Obama's mother had posed for nude photos, and then somebody pointed out that, the idea was she'd posed for them in Hawaii. Turns out the magazine in which there were photos he had taken as evidence, turns out that magazine had ceased publication 2 years before she got to Hawaii. So it's like, two things. It's
didn't know that. That's interesting. This
has been reported online. Anything I say, I get it online, could conceivably be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. But what kind of journalistic standards are those? Would be, I think some of these commenters would say, okay, why? There's a recurring theme here. Barack Obama's black. Trayvon Martin's black. That's, I think, a kind of question they would raise.
Yeah, and have raised, and they've gotten through to me. If anybody's listening, I read those comments, and I'm not unmoved by them.
Well, that's good. Some people don't read comments, and it's hard. It's hard because
there's some cheap shots in there, by the way. But
Yeah, you're telling me. Look, the YouTube commenters like you a lot better than they like me.
Yeah, I know.
And for that matter, the commenters on site. So we have two video manifestations: bloggingheads.tv, the site, the YouTube channel. I don't think I'm super beloved either place, but you have played such a role in building up the YouTube channel following that you're highly regarded, which is the appropriate reaction to.
They have their own conspiracy theories, Bob. I don't know if you noticed this, but our technicians had to take down the second of John and I's two conversations about Trayvon Martin in order to do some editing and then put it back up. So there were a couple of hours when it was there and then wasn't there. And I saw 4 different comments of people saying, did Bob Wright cut you guys out?
I deny responsibility.
We were only down for a couple of hours and then we were back up again.
To the best of my recollection, as they say on the witness stand, I played no role in that. So can I quickly get back to the IDW, the intellectual?
Yeah, let's do it and conclude.
Okay. So I just, when I was listening to you and John, and at the end you were, and I think you invoked the IDW at this point, but also you were saying you were frustrated because there's kinds of things. This is an example of something you just want to know if it's the case.
Right.
You think it's an issue worth exploring, and you don't think that you should be vilified for thinking it's worth getting to the bottom of it. And and just there's a viewpoint you're expressing, you shouldn't be like thought policed about it. I just thought to my stuff on foreign policy and a case where actually some of the thought policing came in a way from the intellectual dark web, or at least from the unofficial magazine. Quillette, as you know, is kind of the unofficial magazine in the intellectual dark web. Okay, so I had Max Blumenthal on my show, young, edgy guy. Look, I don't agree with him about everything. He's to my left. He doesn't express everything the way I would express it. He's intense. He's edgy. Fine. But we do agree that it was a mistake to arm the rebels in Syria. We did it. Our allies did it. It would have been, it's a bad thing when a dictator brutally suppresses an insurrection, which is what would have happened if we hadn't armed the rebels. But I just think it's a worse thing when you wind up with a huge civil war that kills 300,000 more people than would have died. You have 4 million more refugees than would have died. You can say I'm wrong. You can argue. I don't see how you can call that some kind of like immoral or amoral position to take, right? It's a serious argument. So I have Max on the show, and he's been to Syria recently, and he went there, and I think a main part of his point was, look, there are a number of like oversimplifications that helped us get in this mess, and confusions that helped us feed the fires of this mess. We didn't understand, for example, that these rebels themselves commit atrocities. We didn't understand that actually it wasn't like all the people against Assad. There were a number of people who would much rather live under his control than under the rebels' control. These things are always complicated in that way. So he goes through with video and he says, see, these people, they prefer living under Assad now that the civil war is abating. They're glad that the rebels have been expelled. He's making points like this. Mm-hmm. So what do you get? You get suddenly in Quillette, a piece shows up that has a clip of the video of me and Max talking, and the title of it is Tyranny's Mouthpiece. Okay? That's Max. He's Tyranny's mouthpiece. It also attacks a colleague of his named Ronnie Akalik. And it has sentences like, defending the Assad regime is part of Blumenthal's job description these days. I would be surprised if you can find a place where Max says something that is literally a defense of the Assad regime, except maybe by saying, look, on balance, these people are better off under this regime than they would be under the jihadists that we were supporting, who did a certain amount of torture and slaughter themselves. Again, yeah. The view may be wrong, but I don't think it warrants stigmatizing. Here's another thing he says. He quotes me saying to Max, I was kind of agreeing. I was reminding Max, I said, Max, one reason you get into trouble is you don't do what I do, which is at least say the to be sure thing. Say, Assad is a brutal dictator. I don't approve of him. And Max is so kind of like, young and ornery or whatever. He kind of resents having to say the stuff. So anyway, this guy writes, I forget his name for Quillette. I think it's something like Matt Johnson or something. He says, he quotes me saying, it's like you have to say, I think Assad's a horrible person. And then he says, the author of the Quillette piece says, well, yes. And throughout the conversation, Blumenthal said the opposite. Now, excuse me, correct me if I don't understand the English language, but the opposite of Assad is a horrible person is Assad is a good person. Yeah. If this guy, or the editor of Quillette, Claire Lehman, I think is her name, can show me Max saying that, then this is a defensible sentence. If she can't, he is owed an apology. Yeah. Now, the main thing I want to say is that, again, to the extent that Quillette represents the IDW, it has an ideology, and it's showing up here. And it's also showing up in a piece called The Islamic Republic Must Fall, whose final sentence is, that's the title. That's Iran? It's a piece in Quillette, meaning Iran, a piece in Quillette, titled "The Islamic Republic Must Fall," whose final sentence is "The Islamic Republic must fall." Okay, we get the idea. Now, they're not calling for military regime change, but this is all part of an ideological pattern. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But A, be intellectually honest when you're critiquing somebody like Max Blumenthal. B, it is ironic, to say the least, to see this kind of thought policing. And there were some things said about me, by the way, that might be taken to as an attempt to discourage me from having people like Max on and so on. But it is ironic, to say the least, that the unofficial magazine of the intellectual dark web, which professes to be against speech police and thought police and pro-free speech, to run a piece that is as shoddy and ad hominem as this. And finally, I would just say, again, I'm not against them having an ideology. The IDW having, and I'm not saying everyone in the IDW agrees about that kind of, about everything. But there's a kind of a center of ideological gravity that probably encompasses a lot of the members. And I think we see it. There's a coherence if you look at the various things we've talked about in the course of this conversation. Fine to have an ideology. I just think you shouldn't pretend you don't have one if you have one.
Well, if indeed we are somehow here at the Glenn Show connected in spirit with the intellectual dark web, which is somehow connected with the webzine Quillette, I hope they're listening. And invite them to respond to you directly or whatever, Bob.
Yeah, and I hope I didn't get too animated. The trouble is...
No, you're pissed off, it would appear, and I think...
Well, yeah, but you shouldn't appear to be pissed off. You should always seem to be mindful. I wrote a whole book about Buddhism. I shouldn't be like this. But I really think... look, again, maybe somewhere Max, and I don't know about it, has said Assad is a good person, or has said... I don't think he committed any atrocities or something like that. I'd be really shocked. And if he didn't say that, then there is some seriously misleading stuff in this piece. And that's just not, it's just not consistent with the professed ideals of the, intellectual dark web.
Duly noted. So
I want to thank you, Glenn. It's been great, having the honor of being on your very large, your stage
well, you're welcome, Bob. I'm glad you took time to talk with us here at the Humble Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, your platform. Glad to be associated with you. Look forward to the next conversation.
All right. We'll see you then. Take care.
Okay.